For Elon Musk, it was particularly brutal. He grew up in South Africa as a scrawny kid on the autism spectrum, so he had no social input-output skills. He was no friends, and he was beaten up quite often. But the scars from that were minor compared to what happened when he went home after being beaten up once. He was in the hospital for 4 days, but he gets home and his father makes him stand in front of him for 2 hours while the father tells him he's a loser and that it was his fault, and takes the side of the kid who beat up Elon. And so it's one of the oldest tropes in mythology, which is the aspiring young superhero fighting the dark side of the Force and finding out Darth Vader is his father, having to overcome those demons. I think most of us, I mean, you have a very interesting background yourself, from Botswana to Manchester to here in London. I think most of us have things that drive us, and sometimes there's some demons from childhood. But the question is whether you harness those demons or those demons harness you. And in Elon Musk's case, the answer is both.
Do you find that that's nearly always the case, that those demons create both your, as Tim Grover said to me, Tim Grover was the coach for Michael Jordan, Kobe, and he speaks to everybody having a dark side and a light side, and they have a two-way relationship with each other. They typically come from the same place. So he'd speak to Michael Jordan's greatness coming from the same place that his dark side came from.
And you've just described the entire theme of the Elon Musk book, which is darkness and lightness woven together, each coming from the same place, sometimes driving people crazy, sometimes driving them to do things they didn't think they'd be able to do. And you want to take out the dark strands of Elon Musk, the demon mode, as his girlfriend Grimes calls it, where he just truly gets cold and in a very bad place. But if you take out those strands, maybe you don't have Elon Musk at the end, because the dark and the light all come from the same roots. Shakespeare, as usual, said it best. Even the best are molded out of faults. And indeed, that's what you're talking about, whether it's Michael Jordan or Kobe or Elon Musk.
What does Elon think of his father? Did you speak to him directly about him?
Yes. He doesn't speak to his father anymore, of course, and it's a very brutal relationship. But I spoke to his father.
You
and
did?
Yeah, for quite a long time. And still, he's in contact with me. It took a year of traveling around with Elon Musk before I could get him to open up about his father. And that's why a biography done the way Boswell did with Dr. Johnson, and in a much smaller way I tried to do with Elon Musk or Steve Jobs, is important, because you're not just doing a few interviews. You're just with them day in, day out. And after a year, every now and then I'd say, tell me about your childhood, tell me about your dad. And he'd just stare blankly and be not wanting to speak. And then one day, we're actually on this plane flying to California from Texas. And once again, it was very quiet. Finally said, tell me about your dad. It was about the 20th time I'd asked him. He must have been silent for 2 minutes, 3 minutes. I didn't say a word. And then it started coming out, the stories of childhood. And so, yeah, he's still rattled by the memory of it. His father has had 2 children by a young woman that he had raised as a stepdaughter. And so that really messed up Elon's mind.
Elon's father raised a stepdaughter and then had 2 kids with
the stepdaughter, yes. And so there's, and he's talked about it. Elon Musk also is an astonishingly good engineer who gave many good things in childhood. He was at times successful, at times less so.
Errol is his father.
Errol is the father. But he also instilled some of these demons. So it's the most complex relationship. You know, Barack Obama begins one of his memoirs by saying, I think every successful man is either trying to live up to the expectations of his father or live down the sins of his father. And Obama says, in my case, it's both. Well, in Elon's case, it's both.
And what did you learn, if anything, from speaking to Elon's father?
I learned that he was like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in the Stevenson thing, in novel. In other words, he could be a brilliant doctor, but then he'd snap into these demon-like modes, and Mr. Hyde, and hardly remember when he would snap back out and became Dr. Jekyll, hardly remember what happened. And that multiple personality was very much what Elon Musk himself says. Yes, I go through these things. Well, guess what? You see that in Elon Musk.
Based on what you saw in some of the resilient leaders that you've followed, if your job was to create a really resilient child, what would you do to the child?
You know, that's such an interesting question. And those of us who have children in this day and age, I think we can't help but coddling them too much. I watched the way Elon was raised in South Africa, where his father gave him a motorcycle when he was 11 or 12 years old and going around. He would almost free range be that way, Elon would. He could walk or go wherever he wanted, get beaten up, and his parents weren't hovering. Well, likewise, I watch Elon, who has 10 surviving children, and Elon is deeply committed to those children. He's almost obsessed by them. And yet, especially with little X, I don't know if you've seen the 3-year-old kid who is always in the pictures with Elon, like if you see a picture of Elon at the F1.
Oh, yeah, he's holding him.
He's always holding his. I'd be there at night. They'd be doing a solar roof installation at midnight, and Musk would be in hyperdrive, getting all the equipment and telling people what to do, because Musk loved to be hands-on. And I'd watch little X playing amid the cables and heavy equipment. And my instincts are like, go grab this kid and make sure he's safe. But I think that Musk, I remember when they shot off Starship, this largest rocket ever, for the first test, which went well for about 3 minutes. And afterwards, we're sitting down in South Texas at the launch pad behind it and having drinks in their fire pits. And Elon is there with his mother, May, his girlfriend, Grimes, and little X. And X is playing in a fire pit, just putting things in and my instincts are go grab the kid. And Musk says to me, when I was a kid, they used to say, don't play with matches. So I got a box of matches and I played with them behind a tree. And it was his way of saying, I'm going to let X continue to do that. And May Musk said, I think it's one generation of risk seekers training the next. So maybe we should allow our kids to be a little bit more risk-taking as opposed to hovering the way my wife and I do.
And I was reading in your book about how when Elon's parents got a divorce when he was young, that meant that Elon's mother, who was taking care of him, had to then go and get a job, which left Elon at home alone.
Right. That's what I'm saying. He was pretty much home alone. His mother had 3 jobs at times, and she's a great person, but she wasn't somebody who doted and worried every moment of the day. And so she was often not around and divorced from his father. At one point, Elon, as a very young teenager, decides to move back in with his father, which is psychologically, even now, May Musk says, why did he do that? And Kimball, his brother, says he associates pain with love. And Elon Musk says to me, adversity shaped me. It made me who I am. So there's a part of Elon Musk that loves drama and rushing into the fire.
He associates pain with love. From your observations, do you believe that regardless of whether it's healthy or not, we tend to seek out the environment of our childhood when we're older? Because familiarity is almost sometimes seems to be more important to us than whether it's healthy.
That's a brilliant observation, which is, because certainly with Elon Musk, he's almost always trying to recreate the drama, the turmoil of his childhood in apartheid South Africa, seeing people killed and having an psychologically abusive father. And I think we're all different. I'm personally somebody had a pretty nice childhood. My parents were the sweetest, nicest, smartest people I've ever known. And I grew up in New Orleans and still go back there, still live with about 8 blocks from where I was born and see the kids I went to kindergarten with. And I love going back to that magical, we call it the green trees of our childhood. But it's also why I'm not driven. I'm not as a disruptor the way Jobs and Musk are. I'm a little bit more suited to being amused and watching disruptors. So my role is a little bit more as an observer. You've been both. You've been an observer on this podcast or on TV, but you're also a person in the arena by starting companies. I was in the arena quite a while. I ran CNN during the Gulf War, and it was a pretty intense thing to do. But in some ways, I'm not as suited to running into fire and turmoil as Elon Musk is. And when the time came and the Gulf War was over, I decided I'd rather write books and go back to New Orleans.
So do you did touch on this earlier, but it just came back to mind again. Do you think that these individuals who are most able to deal with running into the fire are those that were raised in the fire?
It's not a one-to-one correlation, as people sometimes, when they're arguing with me, they'll say, oh, look, there are people with really bad childhoods who become totally ne'er-do-wells and never amount to anything. And there are people with really wonderful childhoods who are very, very driven. I think, though, it may not be a one-to-one correlation, but it's certainly a non-zero correlation that having something to prove coming out of childhood and having demons to harness tends to drive you a bit more.
One of the things that surprised me in your book was that you said Elon was a good student, but not fantastic.
Yeah, even in South Africa and at boys' school. And then when he goes to college, his SATs are fine, but, they're not all 800s, which is the scale we use in the U.S. For college admissions tests. But he had an intense focus. So when he focused on something, he would be awesomely smart. Problem is, he doesn't like things that don't interest him. So when he had to learn Afrikaans in school and, he flunks it, or when he has to learn certain things. But when it came to engineering, especially material science, he could focus like a laser on, and I mean that figuratively, but on the properties of materials or engineering problems.
And I heard that when he discovered the computer, that was another example of that insane focus. He taught himself to code in a couple of days.
Sure. I mean, he grew up at that time that I can remember and you can't, where computers suddenly pop up. Mm-hmm. You can have your own computer. And that's one of the things Steve Jobs and Bill Gates brought us to, which is, a computer you can actually plug in and have at home and code on. Well, he got one and taught himself C++ and I think maybe Pascal. And at age 12 or 13, coded his own video game called Blastar, which he published. And he becomes addicted to 2 things. One is computers and 2 is video games.
You spoke to his mother quite a lot?
Yeah, still do. She's very much around.
What did she think of him at that age when he's 11, 12? Did she think he was a genius?
Yes. She, for better or worse, was not a doting mother, was not somebody hovering all the time, but was, when Elon was 5 or 6 years old, she decided he was a genius and used to fight with the schools when the schools would sometimes say, he's not doing well in school, and he'd be distracted. He's always looking out of the window and staring blankly. And she would say, because he's a genius and you're not challenging him enough. And I think she still feels he's a genius.
Do you think if someone wanted to be like Elon Musk, they could choose to be?
No. There are certain types of curiosity and drive that we can will ourselves to being. I've written about Benjamin Franklin, for example. Benjamin Franklin was very wise, but he's probably not the smartest of the founders. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way, but you have Hamilton and Jefferson and people who are really brilliant. What you have in Franklin is somebody who's purely curious, always open to new ideas, and unbelievably observant. Well, we can all push ourselves to be that way more, but can we push ourselves to be Einstein? And nah, we can't. And for Musk, he has a certain intensity that I think that even if you drank 50 cups of coffee and you put an electric volt prod in the back of your head, that focus and maniacal intensity and sense of urgency is something that's not instilled in most of us.
Do you think it's a trauma response of sorts?
It's a trauma response. It's also, and the book is got a lot, you can't have a one sentence, here's why, but you start in childhood with the trauma. You also start with a guy who's on the autism spectrum, talks about having Asperger's, as he calls it. And that means he doesn't have good input-output signals for he doesn't have good emotional human receptors, but he does have this intense focus, almost in a geek-like way, on certain engineering or mathematical or coding issues. I think everything from his hardwiring to his childhood and upbringing help make somebody who's addicted to turmoil, who has a maniacal intensity of focus, and also has multiple personality mood swings.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.